Okay, we are going to start chapter 4 today. This is looking at different ways of gathering data. And with today's lesson, we are going to open with this activity called Who Wrote the Federalist Papers? The idea behind this lesson, and I'm not going to behind this activity, and I'm not going to walk through the entire activity with you. We would have done this in class, but it explains up here what the Federalist Papers are. And then this is a little excerpt from the Federalist Papers. And the directions basically are wanting you to choose 5 words from this passage. They are then asking you to count the number of letters in each of those words that you had selected. And then it wants you to find the average word length. Okay, and in terms of how do you go about choosing your 5 words, you are just going to choose 5 words at random. Okay, and the purpose of this activity that we would have done in class is to kind of reinforce the idea of what does it mean when you're choosing something at random. And so for this initial part, each of you were able to choose whatever 5 words you wanted. However, you thought a random process might be for you to choose those 5 words. And we would have done this twice, so you would have randomly chosen 5 words, counted the number of letters in the word, calculated the average word length of those 5 words, wrote that here, and then I asked you to do that a second time, so we have a little bit more data to look at. Okay, we then would have put a dot plot here for everybody in the class for their average word length for each of their 2 samples. Okay, so that gave us several dots here because we had 2 samples for everybody in the class. And then what we were doing on the next page is we were letting the calculator randomly choose what words we selected. Now, there are a couple of videos on my webpage showing you how to seed your random number generator on your calculator, and then how to actually use the feature on your calculator to randomly generate some numbers. Okay, and you can watch that video to see how to do that. It has the calculator on it. This is how it looks on the older calculators. Newer calculators, your screen would look like this, but the idea is in this table, these are all of the words that are in that excerpt from the Federalist Papers, starting with the first word to and ending with the 130th word convention. We were wanting to randomly generate 5 numbers between 1 and 30. So the inputs on the calculator would be the first possible number would be 1, the last possible number would be 130, and we're wanting to generate 5 numbers. In newer calculators, your inputs would look like this. Okay, and the calculator would randomly spit out 5 numbers between 1 and 30, and then you would subsequently choose those 5 words that the calculator randomly selected for you, again averaging those 5 words to get an average word length, and you would repeat that process twice. And then in class we would have also have plotted everyone's 2 samples from the calculator choosing the 5 words randomly as opposed to you, the student, choosing the 5 words randomly. And we would have noticed a pretty extreme difference here between our 2 graphs. And I think the idea is that when you're choosing something randomly, it should never be left up to the person. Okay, because that isn't there. There's always some sense of bias involved there, even though we might feel like, oh, I'm just doing this kind of randomly. It's really only through things like a calculator, that you're using a random number generator, or we'll learn later, a table of random digits, that is a true random process for selecting. And that's kind of what this chapter is going to deal with, is how do we properly gather a sample. Okay, statisticians need to do this all the time. And if the sample that you have selected is not truly a random sample, then the data that you're going to get from that sample isn't really going to be good data to infer things to the overall population. Okay, so selecting things at random is very, very crucial in statistics. So we're going to start with just a little bit here of the notes for 4.1. We're not going to cover very much of this because the activity in class would have taken up several minutes of our time here. Okay, so there are a few terms here that I do want you to be familiar with. The first one is a population. Okay, this says the population in a statistical study is referencing the entire group of individuals about which we're wanting to gather information. By the way, if we were to survey an entire population, which is often not done, although in 2020 there is a census, I can't remember how frequently censuses pop up, but a census is when you have surveyed the entire population, as opposed to typically what happens more in statistics is it's just easier to gather a sample, which is part of a population. And we would analyze the data from that sample, and then using the sample, we would then draw conclusions about the entire population. And that's kind of what this graphic here is showing you. You can see this larger box here is representing the population. Inside that is a smaller sample. Samples in and of themselves do not have to be small. You can still have a large sample. It just means that your population was even larger. From that sample, you would collect your data. That would be a representative sample, and honestly, the only way to properly collect that sample from your population is to use a random process. Okay, and then you would make some inference, that means some conclusion about the overall population based on the sample. Okay. And we're allowed to do that, even though we didn't do a census per se, if the sample we collected was a random sample. Okay, so let's look at an example here. And what we're wanting to do here with this first example is just making sure that we're comfortable identifying the difference between a population and a sample. And so it says here that the directions want us to identify what the population is in the problem and what the sample is in the problem. Okay, so it says a furniture maker buys hardwood in large batches. The supplier is supposed to dry the wood before shipping. Wood that isn't dry seems to not hold its size and shape. I don't know if you guys have ever done like a home improvement project at home and you go to Lowe's and maybe you're looking for a 2x4 and if you actually look at many of the 2x4s at Lowe's anyhow, they often are not straight and have a curvature, and what this is referencing is if the supplier did not allow the wood to dry before they shipped it, it tends to bow or not hold its size and shape. Okay, so reading on, it says the furniture maker chooses 5 pieces of wood from each batch, and he's testing their moisture content. Okay, testing their moisture content. So if any piece would extend past or exceed past 12% moisture, then the entire batch is going to be sent back. Okay, so again, we're looking for what is the population and what is the sample in that particular example. Okay, the population, we don't know how many pieces of wood are in the large batch, but it just mentions that there is a large batch of wood. So I'm going to write that down. Our population is a large batch of wood, and the sample then would be the 5 pieces of wood. Okay, samples are always gathered from a population, so you just want to think about it like that when you're trying to distinguish the differences between those. Identify your population and then ask yourself, what did they choose from that population? In this case, the 5 pieces of wood. Okay, reading on to the next example, it says each week the Gallup poll questions a sample of 1,500 adult U.S. residents to determine national opinion on a wide variety of issues. Okay, you see Gallup polls all the time in the news. Okay, the question is, what would be the population? Well, the population would be all adult U.S. residents. Okay, now let's think about the sample. The sample is how many of those adult U.S. residents that are going to be selected, and it mentioned that they would be choosing 1,500 adult U.S. residents for this particular Gallup poll. Okay, so the idea of a sample survey is kind of a three-step process here. You always want to start by making sure that it's very clear you're defining who or what your population is that you're really wanting to describe, because please keep in mind this graphic up above here, that's kind of what the end goal is. I mean, if it is easy to take a census, let's say your population is actually just a small group, maybe it's just all of Dover High School math teachers, and we're looking to figure out, what's the average number of children that a Dover High School math teacher has. Well, the population there is pretty small. It's like 7 or 8 people. It's not a big deal to take a census. And so the results that you would get from a census, you're not kind of generalizing. That's actually factual, like that's the truth. But oftentimes your population is way too large, and so we draw out a sample, analyze it, and then based on the sample, we infer, which is we're making somewhat of a guess. Okay, there's a little bit of error involved here, but we are inferring something about the population based on the sample. And so step 1 is to define your population that you're wanting to describe. And then step 2 is to say exactly what it is that you're wanting to measure. Okay, a sample survey is a study that is kind of using an organized plan for how you're going to choose a sample to represent your population. And we're going to talk through different ways of how specifically that someone could collect data. Okay, and then finally, you would decide how to choose that sample from your population. Okay. All right. We're just going to briefly talk about bias here, and I want to hit on this, and we'll probably come back to bias actually. But what bias is, and I'm going to highlight this because this is a really crucial piece here in stats. Bias is anytime you are using a method that would favor some outcome over another outcome. Okay, and what tends to happen with bias is your results are either consistently overestimating what the truth is, or your results are consistently underestimating what the truth is. Okay, one or the other. Like, for example, if you were wanting to kind of get a general idea of sort of maybe the adults in Tuscarawas County, whether they are supporting a healthy lifestyle or not. So you choose to go to a grocery store and you stand in the snack and chip aisle and say, well, I'm going to survey every 5th person that walks down this snack and chip aisle. Even though it might feel like, okay, we are kind of using a random process to gather our sample, I'm going to just survey every 5th person. Look at where you're standing and look at what question you're asking. If you're standing in the junk food aisle and your question has to do with whether someone's supporting a healthy lifestyle, not that people can't eat junk food on occasion, but your results are likely going to be biased. They're probably going to consistently underestimate the number of people who really do or have or support a healthy lifestyle, okay? Because you're surveying only people who are down the junk food aisle, okay? So that's what we mean by bias, and we'll definitely touch on bias and like some bad ways. That was the example I just gave, was certainly a bad way to choose a sample. But for now, this is where we're going to stop because we had done that other Federalist paper activity. These few problems are some problems that you would likely be able to do just from this little bit of the notes here.